The world changed this weekend. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the man who ruled Iran for over 30 years, is reportedly dead after a massive 30-bomb strike on his compound.
While Iranians celebrated in the streets of Tehran, we're looking at the big lie that started these strikes and the move that Prime Minister Carney made from Mumbai to back the operation.
Was this a mission for freedom or a desperate distraction for leaders in legal trouble? We're breaking down the end of the Islamic Republic and what this means for Canadian sovereignty.
Okay, everybody, take a breath. Because this weekend, the internet heard one sentence from Mark Carney in Mumbai and decided that Canada just signed up for Trump's war.
And judging by our comments, half of you feel like you've been duped. Because 39 days ago, Mark Carney was at Davos promising us a third path for a sovereign Canada. And yesterday, it looks like he just traded it for a Trump loyalty stamp.
And hey, I get it. We felt it too. That line, Canada supports the United States, well, it hit like Canada was backing Trump full stop. Unconditional support for a man who has spent the last year insulting us, trashing NATO, and treating the international law like a speed bump.
So, is Carney just playing a master move here, staying diplomatic to protect our trade? Or is he leading us straight into a war that we didn't vote for?
And just to be clear, nobody here is defending the Iranian regime. The Iranian people deserve freedom and safety.
But when the salesmen are Trump and Netanyahu, we don't blind trust. We ask, why now, what's the plan, and why are they reselling a nuclear threat they told us was already handled last year?
So let's start with what Carney said, because everyone's reacting to one line and the rest is doing a lot of work.
Carney opens with the practical part. Canada is closely following Iran-related hostilities and urges Canadians in Iran to shelter in place and people in the region to follow local advice and take precautions. That's the government saying, hey, this is dangerous and we want Canadians alive. Full stop.
Then he goes into Canada's long-standing position on Iran. And this is where context matters. He says Iran is a principal source of instability and terror in the Middle East. It has one of the worst human rights records, and it must never be allowed to obtain or develop nuclear weapons. Then he says Canada stands with the Iranian people in their long struggle against an oppressive regime. He notes Canada listed the IRGC as a terrorist entity and sanctioned 256 Iranian entities and 222 individuals.
So far, what you have is protect Canadians, condemn the regime, back the Iranian people, and reject a nuclear Iran.
But then comes the sentence that set everyone off. Canada supports the United States acting to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and to prevent its regime from further threatening international peace and security.
And yes, our first reaction was, why would you phrase it that way? Why hand Trump a headline? Because Trump hears Canada supports the U.S., and turns it into Canada supports me. And he does it with a grin. But here's the thing, people. If you read what Carney actually said, it's not a love letter to Trump. It's a tightrope.
And tightropes are where Canadian prime ministers go to die. Because if you lean 1 inch the wrong way, you're either weak or you're a lapdog. And either way, you're stuck cleaning up someone else's mess.
Now, there's another angle here that matters a lot. Because the timeline tells you things the talking points won't. In June 2025, Trump told the world that Iran's nuclear program was obliterated, fully destroyed. Fast forward to today, and now we're told it's urgent again.
And on top of that, there were reports of negotiations happening very recently with Oman involved as a mediator. And then suddenly, leadership sites are being targeted.
So if you're watching that and thinking, wait, how do you negotiate then bomb the very people at the table? You're not crazy. That's a legitimate question. What is the end goal here? If the goal is stop enrichment, that's one debate. If the goal slides into regime change, well, that's a different universe altogether.
And Trump's own words are being reported as regime change talk. He's calling on Iranians to take over their government. So that's not a small detail. That's the kind of language that turns a military operation into a very long-term mess. And it feeds into the bigger lesson here. Governments like Trump's often act first, then explain later. Sometimes the reason is written after the missiles are already in the air.
And that leads us to what's been going around online. The one about these guys starting wars to avoid accountability. People are angry, and people are connecting the dots, and people are suspicious of the timing, and rightfully so.
Trump is neck deep in the Epstein files, and Netanyahu is wanted for war crimes and charges of corruption. These strikes have taken over the news cycle, and suddenly nobody's thinking about their crimes.
So, here's where we landed after reflecting. Carney is trying to separate the objective from the operator. The objective? Stop nuclear proliferation. That's consistent.
The operator? Trump. Not so consistent and not stable and not trustworthy. And that's where Canada has to be extremely careful, because you can agree on a destination and still refuse to get in the car with a guy who drives like a demolition derby driver.
And that's exactly what this is. Carney's saying, we agree on preventing a nuclear Iran, while trying to keep Canada out of the actual escalation. And to be clear, backing the objective does not mean Canada is joining the war.
But words do matter, because words become pressure, and pressure becomes solidarity, and solidarity becomes send something, do something, prove you're with us. And Canada, we cannot sleepwalk into that.
No. Now, we have to talk about NATO, because this is where a lot of people are understandably furious. NATO is collective defense. It's not a subscription service where you pay monthly and then get dragged into whatever Washington is doing.
So, if Trump spent the year trashing NATO, insulting allies, and treating partners like punching bags, NATO doesn't owe him any support. But what NATO can support are the principles that it's based on: civilian protection, de-escalation, stability, non-proliferation, and defending member states if they are attacked.
Now, what NATO should not do is become a political prop for Trump. And Canada should not become a political prop either.
Especially when we don't have a clear endgame. And that's the issue. Not whether Iran's regime is terrible, we all know it was. Not whether nuclear weapons are a problem, they are. The question is the plan. What is the limit and who's accountable if this goes off the rails?
This is also why Carney's next line really matters. He urges protection of civilians in this conflict. That's Canada trying to keep a moral boundary in a situation where civilians always pay first.
And Canada has to keep saying that out loud, because the second you stop saying it, you normalize civilian suffering as, well, that's just how it goes. And that's been happening too often this past year. And that's exactly why Carney has to be careful with his language, because once this widens, the pressure ramps up, the consequences spread, and the allies get told to pick a side. Which brings us to what this means for Canada in the real world, because even if not a single Canadian soldier goes anywhere, Canadians, we still pay.
Yeah, we pay through fuel costs, shipping costs, insurance spikes, freight delays, travel disruption, and higher prices at the checkout.
We pay through instability in global markets, and we pay through the political knock-on effects when the U.S. expects partners to line up behind decisions made without proper democratic checks.
And if Trump bypasses processes at home, Canada does not follow him into that. You don't reward a behavior with automatic alignment. We don't give automatic alignment to a president who won't even give his own Congress a vote, because that's how you get dragged from supporting an objective to owning the fallout.
Canada can support preventing nuclear weapons, and Canada cannot support someone who spent a year saying we're irrelevant, that we're freeloaders, and that he doesn't need a thing from us. You don't get to spend a year insulting your neighbors and then show up like, hey, bestie, could you co-sign my war for me?
So why does Carney have to be so careful? Well, because he's trying to do three things at once here, and one of them can easily backfire.
1, we have to keep Canada aligned with allies on non-proliferation so Canada isn't isolated. 2, we need to keep Canada out of military escalation because Canada wasn't part of the planning and shouldn't be handed consequences for decisions made elsewhere. And 3, we need to keep Canada's broader strategy intact of building strength as a middle power that doesn't depend on the U.S. behaving.
Because Canadians aren't just worried about Iran. Canadians are worried about Trump. This is a president who's shown that he'll use force. He'll squeeze countries until they crack, and he'll just call it strength.
Look at the pattern. Venezuela gets hit, Iran gets hit, Cuba gets strangled for leverage. This isn't a guy who stays inside the line when he wants something.
And when someone like that keeps saying Canadians are freeloaders, Canadian contributes nothing, trade deals are irrelevant, you don't take that as harmless trash talk. That's him justifying a takeover.
Because if he's willing to throw military weight around overseas and economic weight around everywhere else, then yes, Canadians are afraid that we could be next on the pressure list.
And not because Canada is Iran. Not because Canada is Venezuela, but because Trump doesn't pick fights based on right and wrong. He picks fights based on advantage. He picks fights based on what he wants: oil, minerals, shorelines for resorts, and power.
And the bigger point is this: Trump's team has been openly reviving the Monroe Doctrine, thinking that the Western Hemisphere is America's zone to dominate, and it's only theirs. So is Carney supporting Trump? I don't think he's trying to support Trump the person, but I think he's trying to protect Canada in a moment where the U.S. is the neighbor that you can't move away from.
Exactly. Canada shares intelligence relationships, defense infrastructure, trade routes, a border, and the reality that when Washington sneezes, we usually catch it. So Carney's trying to do two things at once: stand on principle, no nuclear Iran, while being pulled into the method, Trump's chaos.
Now let's talk about the big question we've been asking. Does anyone actually think Trump cares about the Iranian people? Well, I'll say it this way. His record suggests that his decisions are transactional, and transactional leaders don't do long, patient projects for other people's freedom.
If the goal really is supporting the Iranian people, that requires consistency, planning, and follow-through. And the fear, especially from people who study this stuff, is that you get the strike, you get the chaos, and then the people on the ground are left with the consequences.
Including the crackdowns, the shortages, and a regime that tightens its grip the second it feels threatened. And if it falls, then what? In his own words, Trump told the Iranians, "When we are finished, take over your government. This will probably be your only chance for generations." That's not a plan for rebuilding. That's him walking away from the wreckage in advance.
Now, we want to hear from you. What should Canada's line be right now? Support the objective and refuse escalation? Or push for de-escalation and civilian protections louder?
Drop your answer in the comments, and if you haven't watched part 1, watch it right in the links below or at the end of this video, because it only makes sense if you understand why timing and accountability matter.
Remember, Substack is linked below for deeper context, merch supports the work, and A-Team, thank you. You keep this channel independent.
Thanks for watching, everyone, and we will see you in the next one.
Ciao for now.